So hello, I'm Dent's artist in residence this year, and I can't tell you how happy and excited to be here. I practice in the domain of art and science and work in a practice called speculative design, which I'll explain to you as we go on. But as a primer to my presentation, I'm going to start with Plato's allegory of the cave, which many of you might have heard of, but I'm going to give you a primer as a refresher. So in Plato's allegory of the cave, he describes a set of people who have spent their entire lives in a cave, chained, facing a blank wall. And all they can perceive of reality are shadows that they see from a light source behind them. And he goes on to explain that the philosopher is like a prisoner who's freed from this cave and comes to understand that the shadows on the wall don't make up reality at all, and that it is the role of a philosopher to kind of explain this framework. And the reason that I start with this allegory is because my talk is about how art, design, and technology frames and shapes our reality in ways that are not transparent, that technology casts shadows that are not always true to its form. And I won't claim to be a philosopher with heightened powers to perceive the true form of reality, but through my art, I try to create a body of work that strives to sharpen our perception of these projected shadows that Plato describes. So if we're going to talk about shadows and fuzzy edges, a good place to start is perception. Perception is extremely interesting because we know clearly from cognitive science that what our eyes see and what the world we perceive is actually extremely different. So this is your retina and how it sees. We have blood vessels all in the way of our sensors. There's the blind spot, of course. The part of your vision that's actually really high sensitive and high resolution and sensitive to color is just the size of two thumbs held arm's distance away. So everything you and I are seeing are an extension of partial information. We move our eyes around a scene constantly, and they're never still. And by doing this, we sample parts of the world, and we create these anchors that we translate into reality. So we're constantly extending and completing with our minds. We fill in color where there was no color. We fill in shapes where there were no shapes, and that's how a lot of visual illusions work. So your brain is constantly trying to build you a trustworthy reality based on sensory input, and we generate perceptions. So to prove myself some of these few points, I designed a set of glasses to recreate this principle of perceptual adaptation, which George M. Stratton did in experiments back in 1890. So this is a set of glasses I designed that allow you to see the world upside down. And if you wear them every day for the next 3 days, which unfortunately they made grad students do in an experiment, you'll throw up. And then eventually your mind will actually flip everything right side up again. And this is the perfect example of how what your retinas see and the world you actually perceive is different. After 3 days, your mind will actually flip it back up to the reality that it knows. So, everything that you perceive is based on a previous context that you're used to. So what's interesting is that this doesn't just happen when you wear upside-down goggles. Your cognition is always running, adapting what you see to what it thinks you ought to see. And the raw data of sensory input is always filtered by your mind before it becomes what you perceive. And it's really cool because it doesn't just work on visual cues. So if I were to ask you to hold a pencil in your mouth like this for 1 minute, and then I told you a joke afterwards, you would find it funnier than had you not, because you were activating the zygomatic muscles as smiling. So I thought this was kind of interesting. It's kind of like hacking your own biology, and I started to become really obsessed with this idea of embodied cognition. So perception is a fabrication of your mind. You're constantly building a version of reality based on what you perceive through your senses and your cognition. And your mind is constantly being shaped by your context. And what's really critical, though, is that we're actually living in a time where most of the things we perceive, most of the things that make up that priming context are things that we construct ourselves. So there's this feedback loop between the world changing us and us changing the world. We shape our tools, and then our tools shape us, which is a famous quote from media theorist Marshall McLuhan. So I started to obsess over this, and I created maps for mediums or technologies that I thought were silently imposing these cultural ramifications. So perhaps you could say the stone tool was the first primitive extension of our bodies, the first cyborg ape. And then fire, one of our oldest milestones of development, this kind of hearth that creates new social interactions, that emphasizes oral tradition and memory. And then writing becomes a way to capture thoughts. Power through information can begin with writing. And money allows us to create a virtual system by which we express value for everything in the world. And then, of course, there's the internet. The internet creates a global village, mass communication allowing for a hive mindset to apply to the entire world. And people always claim that technology is going to save the world or destroy the world, and the fact is you could probably find valid claims for both sides of these arguments. Because I think as humans, and culture and technology, we all exist in this really complex weave, always changing and going together in collaboration all the time. So at this point, I was studying architecture, and I was in the School of Design, and I got super excited, and I was like, I construct contexts. This is a responsibility, and I can frame realities now. So I started to look for pieces of art and design that kind of do this. So this is one such image that I love. It's by Edgar Urdaneta, and when I look at this image, the fact that objects impose a silent culture of normal comes to surface. It's only when we're too tall or too small is when those transparent interfaces slide away and reveal the embedded assumptions. Another strategy is to construct design for things that don't exist. So this is a piece by Jennifer Kupri called Power Pose. And it's the hallmark CEO pose. And she just kind of creates this jewelry for body language. And studies show that our body posture often communicates more than the words that we say. And it's interesting to me when designers create these kind of interfaces for non-existing things. So I started to realize that there's no such thing as neutral design. Objects solely have practical significance. They carry ritual and symbolic meaning. Can you imagine if the first day at work, this was your keyboard? It's like goodbye, work-life balance. And I love those objects because, we have corporations like Samsung and Apple dictating what it means to be human. Can you imagine if you didn't have an email address, or if you didn't have a phone, or if your phone wasn't the smart kind, and people would probably think you don't exist. We've decided this is what it means to be human now. This is an image from Pope Francis's first day on the job, and people are coming to greet him almost as importantly with their devices as with their eyes and their bodies. So, I was thinking to myself, we need to insert objects into the world with alternate purposes, or at least to kind of reveal some of these assumptions that we're making. So this is an art piece that I made called Iris. It's a helmet with an aperture that remains closed, obscuring your vision, until someone approaches you and holds your hand. And in making this project, I was thinking about how have our access to constant network devices changed the way we socialize? Have they changed traditional public spaces into these liminal spaces where we're just in our own private communication networks? Or is this really a new phenomena? Or is it just part of human nature? Part of a weave of other factors that have primed us to behave in this way? So it was partially a reaction to these thoughts and a bunch of articles that kept popping up in my feed about how texting and smartphones have made us touch deprived or too awkward to make eye contact. And so I made this piece. I remember, I was inspired. I was at this party where nobody was looking or talking to each other, and we're just all looking at our smartphones, and I'm a little bit socially anxious. I was like, yeah, I have so many friends on my phone. I was like, what would be something that I could make that would force me to interact with someone? And it was a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but I was thinking a lot about, do we depend more on technology and less on each other? How have our notions of autonomy shifted? What does it mean to reinsert human dependency through the interface of a machine? So these were some of the questions I was asking as I was making this kind of experimental, social, robotic art. So the next piece, famously in the 60s, Marshall McLuhan kind of predicts in a certain way the advent of the internet. He talks about a time where there will be electronic interdependence, where humankind will move from individualism and fragmentation to a collective identity. And he called this new social organization the global village. And of course, today, we find that we live in this global village, in this unified field of consciousness where trends spread faster than the speed of light through Insta, #gramming, tweets, or what have you. And of course, there's a lot of commercial objects that let you record and share your lives and data from vantages unknown before. In addition to your smartphone, which most people use primarily to take selfies, there's objects like the GoPro, which straps onto your body and allows you to record vigorous activities and share them. There was the much discussed Google Glass, which also allowed you to continuously record your life as it happens and stream it at real time. So these experiments, in an experiment about this kind of new cultural landscape, I created this set of devices which let you swap vision with someone in real time. And I will note that maybe some of these technologies look kind of old because I was just learning how to make circuits at this time in 2014. So with this piece, I sought to explore if we're really living in this kind of cybernetic global village, what would it be like if I exchanged one of my sensory apparatuses with yours? What is it like to see through the eyes of someone else? Like more than like hyper live blogging. So these are two helmets that let you swap vision, and I shared them with people. And what was kind of interesting is when I wore this for a prolonged period of time, I actually did become tethered to someone. So like if you give your eyeballs to someone else, your vision is basically useless. Like I would walk around and run into a trash can. And then after a while, the person that I was swapping vision with would hear the crashing sound and he would whip his head over, and then I would see myself crashing into a trash can. And then we became this kind of like networked mind where like we relied on each other, and we became kind of like sensorially tethered, which was kind of interesting. So, you know, we probably already live in some kind of collective convergent mind through the internet, cybernetics, and other technologies. And at this time I was asking myself, what kind of art reflects that? What kind of design reflects that? And how do we talk about these things? Which brings me to my current preoccupations at the Media Lab. I'm at MIT Media Lab in a group called Design Fiction. So to answer a question I get a lot is, what is design fiction? And I would say that it's the use of design to ask questions. So for instance, if I were designing cosmetics, I would ask, what if my makeup wasn't just aesthetic, but protected me against facial recognition algorithms? What proportions of my face would I need to cover? Or if instead of attracting a suitor, my manicure collected DNA from him and I could analyze whether he was a compatible suitor? What kind of world would that be, right? So I'm part of this relatively new group at MIT Media Lab where we're wedged somewhere between art, design, science fiction, and science fact. And at MIT, I'm lucky enough to rub shoulders with brilliant scientists, everything from synthetic neurobiology, artificial intelligence to artificial life. And across campus, I would say there are brilliant scientists asking in their labs, like, how do I make the world a better place? And I think part of what my group likes to ask is, what is better? What is better for you, for me, for a gay woman, a retired veteran, a kindergartner with a prosthetic? I believe it's the role of artists and designers to raise critical questions, and that art is how we can see and feel the future. And today is a really amazing time to be a designer because there's all kinds of new tools becoming accessible. So for instance, in the relatively new field of synthetic biology, you can seek to write biology by making a design problem. And through these developments, my lab asks, what is the role and responsibilities of a designer, a scientist, a businessman in these emerging fields, and what kind of possibilities do they offer? What are the current and future implications of genetic engineering, synthetic biology, and how are they changing our perception of the self, society, and evolution? What kind of humans will we be in the future, and what are the stakes in the game? So as you know, I was doing a bunch of work about humans, machines, cyborgs, and networked post-humanism, and then I got to MIT, and the director was like, digital is dead, bio's the new digital. So I started to look around at that landscape, and I joined a biohacking club, and I started to learn a new language. I asked myself, what are some potent things about making art with life itself? And it became honestly kind of scary because previously I'd been working in metaphors and simulations, and suddenly I was making gene edits. And it felt a lot more real. So I got unleashed into a wet lab, knowing nothing. And I started by learning how to engineer E. coli to fluoresce different colors, one of which was the color of my nail polish. And I started to grow bacteria from different parts of my body. And I learned how to sequence and read them. And feeling the urge to learn more about my body's bacteria, my microbiome, more intuitively, I decided to make music with my bacteria. And a bunch of friends and I we designed this giant petri dish in the shape of an LP. And we created a record player that used computer vision to create music from our microbiome. And because it's super nerdy and we're at MIT, we DJ'd it at parties. And I had the amazing experience of teaching kids about bacteria on their bodies and the microbiome, and we created music tracks for each of them, and it was really fun. And along the way, I learned a lot about chemistry, and I learned how to create a perfume that smelled exactly like my husband, because we're in this long-distance relationship. And all this time, I'm learning these new wet lab skills, and I'm thinking, in the same way that I made the previous projects, what is something I could really say through bioart? And at this point, I was keeping a microbial diary where I was keeping track of my mood every day and swabbing. I was trying to see if there were any correlations between the way I felt and the kind of bacteria that was growing on me. And funny enough, the day after the election, I was like crying basically the whole day, and I got an eye infection, and that petri dish actually ended up smelling rancid. I was like, oh man. So in light of the recent election, I've been thinking a lot about biopolitics and what does activism look like in bioart? And I started thinking, well, you know, the body has always been a site of contention. The reproductive organs of the female body have always been this unfortunate site of contention, where opposing ideologies in religion, politics, and cultural differences often play out. And perhaps of all these questions, one of reproductive rights often strikes a particularly sensitive nerve. And as many of you know, Donald Trump signed this executive order which cut off all federal funding to NGOs whose work includes abortion services or advocacy. And I was just like, so images of this executive order being signed circulated on the internet and went viral. And all across Twitter, people are asking, why do these men feel like they have a right to determine a woman's reproductive choices? So I'm doing this weird new project where through an artwork of female empowerment, I'm challenging the status quo by engineering a system by which I, a woman, can control something inherently and symbolically male, sperm. So I'm using this brain controller interface, this EEG machine that captures the electric signals generated by my thoughts and translates those signals into a system that I've engineered to control sperm in an XY axis through a phenomenon known as galvanotaxis, which is one in which microorganisms like paramecia in sperm will swim towards a particular way in an electric field. So in this case, at 12 volts per centimeter towards the positive. So in this project, I'm asking things like, what symbolic implications are there to a woman controlling sperm with her thoughts? What are some counter-narratives to a history of female reproduction being controlled predominantly by men? And in an age of technological advancement, when we often speak of transcending our bodies to the point of posthumanism, why are we still influenced by theories of biological determinism? So in this project, I explore themes through the symbolic act of controlling the cellular unit of male reproduction. And I guess if there's one message I'd like an audience of my work to take away is that there's no neutral design, there's no neutral tools, no neutral technology. Our perception is always mediated by the very context that we're constantly creating ourselves, which is why I think it's so important to insert our own speculative designs, our own aspirations. And I guess going with the way Jason was giving his talk yesterday, perhaps you can even say that art has an isomorphic relationship to reality. So this is a brief interlude into some of my experiments and thoughts. And I often like to end my talks with this quote. It's a famous design mantra that form follows function. Well, now lodged somewhere between design, technology, and art, I ask, what if fiction informs fact? What kind of R&D lab would that look like, and what kind of questions would we ask together? In today's day and age, we often look to technology as the immediate answer. And as an artist, designer, and speculative dreamer, I urge you to ask, but what was the question? Thanks.